The first sign of trouble wasn't a letter or a shouted warning. It was the quiet, methodical clicks of a camera shutter. Brandon Zeller was on his knees in the soft earth beside his newly finished workshop, tamping down the last of the river stones for a small walkway. It was a Saturday morning in early October, and the air in the Summit Creek Estates had the crisp, clean scent of pine and impending autumn. He heard the whisper of tires on the gravel of his private drive and looked up, expecting a delivery. Instead, he saw Charlene Griffin's navy blue BMW SUV parked just beyond his property line, its engine purring with an air of expensive impatience. Charlene, president of the Summit Creek Homeowners Association, stood on the common area grass, arms crossed, a vision in a cream-colored pantsuit that was entirely too formal for the mountain setting. Beside her stood a harried-looking man in a branded polo shirt, Mr. Davies from Sterling Management Solutions. The company, the HOA, paid a small fortune to handle their administrative affairs. It was Davies who held the camera, pointing its lens directly at Brandon's workshop. Brandon slowly rose, brushing the dirt from the knees of his jeans. He was an architect, a man who found comfort in right angles, precise measurements, and the logical flow of a well-executed plan. The workshop, a modest but beautifully crafted structure of cedar and glass, was the culmination of a year of weekends. It was his sanctuary, the place he came to sketch, to think, and to feel the lingering presence of his late father, the master carpenter who had taught him everything he knew about building. "Morning, Charlene." "Mr. Davies," Brandon said, his voice even and calm. He walked toward them but stopped precisely at the edge of his lawn, marked by a line of discreet survey stakes he'd installed himself. "Can I help you with something?" Charlene offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Brandon, we were just conducting a routine community standards inspection. It seems a new structure has appeared on your lot." She gestured toward the workshop with a flick of her wrist, as if it were an unsightly piece of litter. Mr. Davies lowered his camera, his gaze darting between Charlene and Brandon. "Just documenting for the file. Mr. Zeller, standard procedure." "I see," Brandon said, his eyes fixed on Charlene. "And what standard is it you believe I'm not meeting? I have a county-approved building permit, and the structure is well within the setback requirements for my parcel." "The Summit Creek architectural guidelines are quite clear about maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the community," Charlene recited, the words sounding rehearsed. "All outbuildings must be pre-approved by the Architectural Control Committee to ensure they align with our neighborhood's character." "It's a 10 by 12-foot shed. Charlene, it matches the color and materials of my house perfectly," Brandon countered. Still polite, "I read the guidelines. They state that structures under 150 square feet that are not visible from the common roadway don't require pre-approval." The smile on Charlene's face tightened. "There's been an addendum. Perhaps you missed it. In any case, you'll be hearing from us." She turned, her heels digging slightly into the manicured turf of the common area. "Have a lovely weekend, Brandon." Mr. Davies gave a nervous nod and scurried after her. The BMW pulled away, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and a profound sense of unease. Brandon stood for a long moment, looking from his workshop, his quiet monument to his father's memory, to the empty space where the car had been. He knew, with the certainty of a perfectly drawn blueprint, that this was not about aesthetic harmony. This was a declaration. He pulled out his phone, took a picture of the tire tracks just off his driveway, and then dialed his sister. The workshop was Brandon's refuge. Inside, the scent of fresh-cut cedar hung in the air, a clean, sharp perfume that always reminded him of his father's woodshop. Tools hung in precise order on a pegboard wall, chisels and saws that had belonged to his father, their wooden handles worn smooth by a lifetime of use, resting alongside the modern, laser-guided levels and digital calipers of his own trade. On a large drafting table under a skylight lay the original, hand-drawn plans for the workshop itself, each line rendered with an architect's obsessive precision. This small building was more than just a place to store tools. It was a physical manifestation of his grief, a project he'd poured his sorrow and his love into after his father's passing 2 years ago. It was the last thing they had designed together, and building it had felt like a final, quiet conversation. "She's baiting you," said Sarah, his younger sister, her voice a clear, pragmatic signal from her law office 3 states away. "This is a classic HOA power play. They start with something vague and intimidating to see if you'll just roll over." Brandon leaned against the workbench, tracing the grain of the wood with his finger. "I told her I had the permits. I followed every rule, both county and HOA. The shed isn't even visible from the main road." "Doesn't matter," Sarah said. "People like her don't care about the rules. They care about the power to enforce the rules. Right now, your only job is to be the perfect, rule-following homeowner. Do not get emotional. Do not get angry. You document everything, every conversation, every email, every certified letter. You create a timeline so meticulous that a judge could follow it without a single question." "Got it." "Got it," Brandon confirmed. He spent the rest of the weekend doing just that. He scanned his county permit, his property survey map, and the section of the HOA bylaws he had downloaded 6 months prior. He created a new folder on his computer, labeled HOA Correspondence, and saved the photos he'd taken of Charlene's visit. He was an architect. Structure and documentation were his native languages. He felt the familiar, calming rhythm of imposing order on chaos. He was preparing for a fight, but he would do it on his own terms, with facts and figures as his only weapons. He heard nothing for a week. The autumn leaves began to turn, painting the hillsides in strokes of gold and crimson. A fragile sense of peace returned. Perhaps Charlene had bigger battles to fight, other residents to harass. Perhaps he had overestimated her resolve. Then, the following Tuesday, the mail carrier's truck lingered at his mailbox longer than usual. When Brandon went to check it, he found a crisp, green envelope waiting for him. It required a signature, certified mail. His stomach tightened. Inside, on heavy, cream-colored letterhead bearing the Sterling Management logo, was the official violation letter. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic aggression, polite in tone, but utterly inflexible in its demands. "Dear Mr. Zeller," it began. "This letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC&Rs for the Summit Creek Estates Homeowners Association. During a recent inspection of your property at 114 Overlook Path Lot 72, it was noted that an unapproved accessory structure has been erected. This is in direct violation of CC&R FAR 8.4.2, which states all improvements, including but not limited to fences, outbuildings, and significant landscaping modifications, must adhere to the community's established architectural guidelines and may be subject to review to preserve view corridors and maintain neighborhood character. You are hereby required to remove the unapproved structure within 14 days of the date of this notice. Failure to comply will result in further enforcement action, including daily fines and a formal hearing before the Architectural Control Committee ACC. Brandon read the letter 3 times. The casual mention of view corridors snagged his attention. His property was on the upper ridge of the development, but his view was of the state forest, not of the valley below where the more expensive homes were. Whose view could his small workshop possibly be obstructing? He pulled up the CCNRs on his computer and navigated to Figure 8.4.2. The language was as vague and malleable as Charlene had suggested. Preserve view corridors and maintain neighborhood character were subjective phrases, easily weaponized. The 14-day deadline was the real threat. It was designed to induce panic, to force a hasty, ill-considered capitulation. Brandon took a deep breath, picturing his father's steady hands guiding a plane over a piece of rough-sawn lumber, shaving away imperfections until only a smooth, true surface remained. He would not panic. He would respond with the same precision. He sat down at his desk and began to compose a formal, polite, and meticulously detailed reply, citing the specific bylaws he had followed and respectfully requesting clarification on the alleged view corridor infringement. He attached copies of his permit and survey. He sent it via email to Mr. Davies and the general ACC inbox, creating a digital paper trail. Then, he printed a copy and sent it via certified mail right back to them. The ball was in their court, but as he looked out his window at the workshop, standing quiet and resolute under the afternoon sun, he had the distinct feeling that the game was already rigged. Brandon received no direct reply to his email or his certified letter. The only acknowledgement was an automated response from the Sterling Management Portal confirming his message had been received. The silence was unnerving, a calculated display of power. He was a homeowner with a question. They were the authority with no obligation to answer. The 14-day compliance window ticked down with maddening slowness. On the 10th day, another green certified envelope arrived. It was not a response to his questions, but a notice of hearing. He was being summoned to appear before the Architectural Control Committee the following Wednesday at 7:00 p.m. in the community clubhouse. The notice stated he would be given an opportunity to present his case regarding the violation. The clubhouse meeting room was small and stuffy, paneled in dated knotty pine, and lit by fluorescent fixtures that cast a sickly, pale light on the proceedings. A long folding table sat at the front, behind which sat Charlene Griffin and two other board members, a stern-faced man named Robert and a woman who looked profoundly bored. Mr. Davies sat at the end of the table with a laptop, acting as secretary. About a dozen other homeowners were scattered in the folding chairs. There, for their own minor infractions, a discolored mailbox, a rogue basketball hoop, an unapproved variety of rosebush. When Brandon's name was called, he walked to the front of the room and stood before the table. He had brought a folder containing pristine copies of his survey, his permit, and a satellite image of his property clearly showing the workshop's discrete location. "Mr. Zeller," Charlene began, her voice resonating with rehearsed authority, "you are here regarding the unapproved structure on Lot 72. The committee has reviewed the file. Do you have anything to add before we render a decision?" The phrasing was deliberate add, not present. It implied the decision was already a foregone conclusion. "I do," Brandon said calmly. He laid the county-approved building permit on the table. "First, this is the permit issued by the county, confirming the structure meets all legal and safety codes." He then laid down the property survey. "This is the official survey of my lot, showing the workshop is built 15 feet from any property line, exceeding the 10-foot setback requirement in our bylaws." Finally, he produced the satellite photo, and this image demonstrates that the building is not visible from the community's main road and does not impede any discernible view from neighboring properties. I'd be grateful if the committee could specify which view corridor, as cited in CCNR, where 8.4.2 is being affected. He had been clear, factual, and respectful. He had given them an opportunity to engage with the evidence. Charlene did not look at his documents. She glanced at Robert, who simply shook his head. The county's authority does not supersede the association's CC&Rs, she stated flatly. And the board has its own official plat map, which clearly delineates the community's protected view corridors. Your structure is in violation of those established lines. May I see that map? Brandon asked. Charlene's smile was a thin, dismissive line. It's an internal document, used by the Committee for Enforcement purposes. It is not available for public review. A low murmur rippled through the audience. A homeowner being denied access to a document used to prosecute him was a new level of procedural opacity. So, to be clear, Brandon said, his voice remaining level, the board is fining me based on evidence you refuse to produce. The board is fining you for violating the governing documents you agreed to abide by when you purchased your home, Charlene retorted, her tone sharp. She looked to her fellow board members. I move that we find Lot 72 in violation and impose the standard fine of $100 per day, retroactive to the date of the original notice, until the violation is cured. All in favor. 2 hands went up immediately. The board woman hesitated for a fraction of a second before lethargically raising hers. Mr. Davies typed furiously. The motion carries, Charlene announced, a glint of triumph in her eyes. You will receive a formal notice of the decision and the outstanding fine amount within 48 hours. Next case. Brandon stood there for a moment, the rejected document still on the table. He had presented logic, and they had countered with raw power. He had asked for evidence, and they had hidden behind secrecy. The hearing was a sham, a piece of theater designed to legitimize a predetermined outcome. He gathered his papers, gave a slight, formal nod, and walked out of the stuffy room into the cool night air. The first obstacle had not been a hurdle to clear. It had been a solid wall. He realized then that he couldn't win by playing their game. He would have to change the game itself. The fines began accumulating immediately, a digital ledger of defiance that grew by $100 each day. Brandon started his investigation not with anger, but with the methodical calm he brought to every architectural project. The foundation had to be solid. His first step was to formally request all board and ACC meeting minutes from the past 2 years through the Sterling Management Homeowner Portal. A week later, he received a link to a password-protected folder of PDF documents. As he opened them, a pattern emerged. The minutes were, as he'd suspected, heavily redacted. Entire pages concerning budget approvals and contract negotiations were blacked out. But the most significant redactions were clustered around a series of meetings held the previous autumn. The topic listed was CC&R Section 8 amendments. The specific discussion, motions, and vote counts were completely obscured by thick black bars, with a footnote citing attorney-client privilege and protection of resident privacy. This was where they had manufactured the flimsy pretext of VOR 8.4.2. He needed to talk to someone who had been in that room. He remembered a man named George Petrov, a retired engineer who had served on the board for a year before abruptly resigning. Brandon found his address in the community directory and drove to his house on the other side of the development. George answered the door with a weary reluctance. He was a kind-faced man in his late 60s, with deep-set eyes that held a shadow of old frustrations. I'm not on the board anymore, son, he said, before Brandon could even finish his introduction. I know, Mr. Petrov, Brandon said. That's why I'm here. I'm hoping you can tell me why. George hesitated, then sighed and gestured for Brandon to come inside. They sat in a sunlit living room filled with books on engineering and history. Charlene, he said. The name itself an explanation. She came in with a mandate for strong leadership. What that meant was a complete consolidation of power. She pushed through a change in the bylaws that allowed the president to enter into contracts under $5,000 without full board approval. Then, she started pushing the Section 8 amendments. "The view corridors," Brandon stated. George nodded grimly. She claimed it was to protect property values. But the language was so broad, it could mean anything she wanted it to mean. Our lawyer at the time, a sharp woman named Ms. Albright, warned her. She said you can't just invent an easement on someone's private property after the fact. She said it was legally indefensible. Charlene held a closed-door executive session, and a week later, Ms. Albright had resigned due to personal reasons. A new, more compliant law firm was hired. The amendment was pushed through at a poorly attended meeting right before Thanksgiving. And I submitted my resignation the next day. "I'm a structural engineer. Mr. Zeller. I can't be part of something with such a rotten foundation." This was the break Brandon needed. The name of the former lawyer. The context of the amendment. It was all clicking into place. But he needed proof. Something more concrete than a retired man's story. He needed the document Charlene had refused to show him, the official map. His next stop was the county recorder's office, a beige, soulless building downtown. The air inside smelled of old paper and weak coffee. He spent 3 frustrating hours navigating a labyrinthine system of microfiche readers and outdated computer terminals. Just as he was about to give up, a woman with a neat silver bob and sharp, intelligent eyes approached him. "You look like a man wrestling with a plat map," she said with a wry smile. "Is it that obvious?" Brandon replied. "I was a county clerk in this office for 30 years. I know the look," she said, extending a hand. "Eleanor Vance. I live up in Summit Creek, too. Lot 14. Brandon shook her hand, a surge of hope cutting through his frustration. He explained his situation. The fight over the shed. The mysterious view corridor map the HOA was using. Eleanor's expression hardened. "Charlene Griffin. Of course. She runs that place like her own private fiefdom. Let me show you how to find what you're really looking for." She guided him not to the digital archives, but to a massive, leather-bound book in a climate-controlled room. "These are the original subdivision plats," she explained, her fingers expertly tracing the index. "When Summit Creek was developed in 1987, the county approved this master plan. Any easement utility, access, drainage had to be recorded here. It's a public record. It cannot be altered by an HOA." She turned to a large, creased page showing the layout for his section of the development. She pointed a slender finger at his lot. "There you are. Lot 72. And there's your easement." Brandon leaned in. The map clearly showed a dotted line running along the back of his property, labeled 10, Utility Easement. There was no mention of a view corridor, no 30-foot swath of protected air. There was nothing. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The HOA's map wasn't just an internal document. It was a fabrication, a fraudulent map created for the sole purpose of exercising power they did not legally possess. Eleanor must have seen the realization dawn on his face. "Now you know," she said quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" As Brandon drove home, the official, certified copy of the 1987 plat map resting on the passenger seat like a holy relic. His mind was racing. It wasn't enough to know the HOA's map was a fake. He needed to understand why. Why go to the trouble of forging documents and bullying residents over a tiny shed? The answer, he suspected, lay with the man George Petrov had mentioned Charlene's former lawyer, Ms. Albright. Finding her was easier than he expected. A quick search revealed she had left the corporate law firm the HOA now used and had started her own small practice specializing in real estate law. He called her office, not expecting to get through, but left a polite, concise message identifying himself as a Summit Creek resident and mentioning George Petrov's name. To his surprise, she called him back that evening. Her voice was cautious but professional. "I cannot discuss the specifics of my previous work for the association due to privilege," she began. "I understand that," Brandon said. "I'm not asking you to. But I believe the board may be acting on advice that you explicitly warned them against, and, in doing so, are putting the entire community at legal risk. I have a copy of the original 1987 plat map for my lot." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "And I assume it doesn't show a 30-foot view corridor easement," she said, her tone shifting from guarded to interested. "It does not," Brandon confirmed. There was a longer silence. "Mr. Zeller," she said finally, "I cannot act as your counsel. But if a former board member, say, someone like George Petrov, were to find an old email in his personal archive, an email that was sent to the entire board, and therefore not subject to the same level of confidentiality as a direct communication, and if he were to forward that to you as a concerned resident, well, that would be a different matter entirely." It was a carefully worded roadmap. Brandon called George immediately. An hour later, an email appeared in his inbox. The subject line was FWD Urgent Legal Opinion on Proposed Section 8 Amendments. It was from Ms. Albright to the entire 2021 HOA Board, including Charlene and George. Brandon's breath caught as he read. The unredacted text was a legal bombshell. "Charlene and members of the board. Per our discussion, I have reviewed the proposed amendment to CC&R Figure 8.4.2 regarding the creation of view corridor easements. To be unequivocally clear, my professional opinion is that this amendment is legally indefensible. An easement is a real property interest. It cannot be unilaterally imposed on a homeowner's private property through a simple bylaw amendment without 100% consent of the affected property owners. Attempting to enforce such a provision would be a breach of the board's fiduciary duty and would almost certainly expose the association to significant legal liability. I have also been made aware of the pressure being applied to Mrs. Gable regarding her back patio, and I must advise you that this action falls under the same flawed legal pretext. I strongly recommend the board abandon this course of action immediately." There it was, the smoking gun. Not only had Charlene been warned, but she had been warned in the most explicit terms possible. And the email confirmed another victim, Mrs. Gable, a sweet, elderly widow who lived 2 doors down from Brandon. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a late-night search of the County Planning Department's public records. A new development proposal had recently been filed for the large, undeveloped parcel of land adjacent to Summit Creek. The developer was a company called Vantage Point Properties, and they were planning a series of multi-million-dollar luxury condos. Brandon downloaded their promotional brochure. The language was aspirational and effusive. But one phrase jumped off the page. Each unit features breathtaking, protected panoramic views of the National Forest, guaranteed by permanent view corridor easements. It all made a terrifying kind of sense. The fake map, the illegal amendment, the harassment. It was all a scheme to create a de facto easement across properties like his, clearing the way for a developer. The only remaining question was Charlene's motive. A quick search of state business filings provided the answer. The registered agent for Vantage Point Properties was a holding company, and a deeper dive into that company's corporate officers revealed a familiar name on the board of directors: Daniel Griffin, Charlene's husband. This wasn't just about power. It was about money. Potentially millions of dollars in kickbacks and inflated property values, built on a foundation of lies. The war over his shed had just become a crusade against systemic corruption. just as Brandon was assimilating the scale of Charlene's fraud. She escalated her attack. The next piece of certified mail wasn't a letter. It was a legal notice. An intent to place a lien on his property. The accumulated fines, plus newly added legal fees and administrative costs, now totaled over $2,800. The document stated that if the amount was not paid within 30 days, the HOA would formally file a lien, clouding the title to his home and making it impossible to sell or refinance. This was the nuclear option in the HOA arsenal, a direct threat to his most significant financial asset. The polite fiction of community governance had been stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly mechanics of extortion. Simultaneously, the social pressure intensified. Charlene began a whisper campaign, a subtle but insidious war of attrition. Brandon noticed it in the small interactions of daily life. Neighbors who used to wave would suddenly become intensely interested in their landscaping as he drove by. A friendly couple he often chatted with at the community mailboxes gave him a tight, nervous smile and cut their conversation short. He overheard snippets of conversation at the local grocery store, holding the whole community hostage, driving down property values, thinks the rules don't apply to him. Charlene was painting him as a selfish renegade, a troublemaker whose stubbornness was threatening the placid harmony of their suburban enclave. The narrative was simple, effective, and completely false. The cruelest blow came from the one person he thought was an innocent bystander. One afternoon, he saw Mrs. Gable in her front yard, tending to her prize-winning roses. She was a kind, gentle woman in her late 70s who had lived in Summit Creek since it was first built. When she saw Brandon, her face, usually wreathed in a grandmotherly smile, crumpled with anxiety. She walked hesitantly toward his driveway, twisting a pair of gardening gloves in her hands. "Brandon, dear," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I have a word with you?" "Of course. Eleanor," he said, using her first name as she had insisted he do weeks ago when he'd met her at the clerk's office. He realized his mistake, but she didn't seem to notice. He was thinking of the wrong Eleanor. This was Margaret Gable. "Of course. Margaret, is everything all right?" "It's the board," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "They sent me another letter about my garden gnomes. They say they're an unapproved lawn ornamentation. They're fining me $25 a day." Brandon felt a surge of protective anger. "That's absurd. They've been there for 10 years. "I know," she whispered, "but they said if I don't comply, they'll send me to the committee, the same way they did with you." She looked up at him, her expression a heartbreaking mixture of fear and pleading. "Brandon, please. I know you think you're doing the right thing, but you're making her angry. She's taking it out on all of us. I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford these fines. Can't you just move the shed? Please, for the sake of your neighbors. Don't make waves." Her plea struck him harder than the lien notice. He was so focused on his righteous battle, on the principles of law and property rights, that he hadn't fully considered the collateral damage. His principled stand was causing suffering for the very people he was, in a larger sense, trying to protect. That night, he sat in his workshop, the plans for its construction still laid out on his desk. He felt a profound wave of doubt. Was this fight worth Margaret's peace of mind? Was his need to be right more important than the well-being of his elderly neighbor? He called his sister, Sarah, and laid out the moral quandary. "This is what bullies do, Brandon," she said, her voice firm. "They can't beat you on the facts, so they target the vulnerable people around you to make you surrender. If you back down now, you're telling Charlene that her tactics work. You'll move your shed. And next month she'll be after Margaret's roses. And then, someone else's fence. You're not just fighting for a building. You're fighting for the soul of the community. Don't you dare give up now." Her words stiffened his resolve. He wasn't the one hurting Margaret Gable. Charlene was. And the only way to stop her was to see this through to the end. He looked at the evidence he had compiled: the map, the email, the developer's brochure. The annual members' meeting was in 2 weeks. It was the one time all year that the board couldn't control the agenda. The one forum where any member had a guaranteed right to speak. He had already registered for a 5-minute public comment slot. It was time to finalize his battle plan. The community center auditorium buzzed with the low murmur of aggrieved homeowners. It was the night of the annual members' meeting, and the room was packed. More than 100 residents filled the folding chairs, drawn by a potent combination of civic duty and the rumored promise of a showdown. At the front of the room, Charlene Griffin sat at the center of the long board table, flanked by her allies. A large digital clock was projected on the screen behind them, its red numerals a stark reminder of the rigid agenda. Brandon sat in the third row, a slim leather portfolio resting on his lap. He had spent the last week preparing for this moment, rehearsing his 5-minute speech until he could deliver it from memory, timing each revelation for maximum impact. His heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. Just before the meeting began, Margaret Gable slipped into the seat beside him. She looked pale and distressed. "Brandon," she whispered, clutching his arm. "I received a settlement offer from the HOA's insurance company for the patio issue Ms. Albright mentioned in that old email. My lawyer says it's a good offer, but it's contingent on me not participating in any public action against the board. Please, whatever you have planned, don't mention my name. Don't read that part of the email. It could ruin everything for me." This was the final test. The unredacted email, with its specific mention of the harassment against Mrs. Gable, was his most powerful piece of evidence proving a pattern of abuse. Using it would be a devastating blow to Charlene's credibility, but it would also harm the innocent woman beside him. In that moment, he had to choose between total victory and compassionate integrity. He looked into her pleading eyes and made his decision. "I won't mention your name, Margaret," he promised. "You have my word." The meeting dragged on with tedious reports from the landscaping and social committees. Finally, Charlene announced, "We will now proceed to the open comment period. Each speaker will have exactly 5 minutes. First on the list is Brandon Zeller." A hush fell over the room. Charlene gave him a look of pure venom. Given that Mr. Zeller is currently in violation and subject to ongoing enforcement action, I move that we table his comments to avoid discussion of a pending legal matter. Before the board could vote, Eleanor Vance, the retired county clerk, stood up from the back of the room. "Point of order. Madam President," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "Robert's Rules of Order state that a member's right to speak during the open comment period cannot be suspended unless their comments are slanderous or disorderly. Mr. Zeller has not yet spoken. You are out of order." The room erupted in applause. Defeated, Charlene gestured curtly to the podium. 5 minutes, she snapped. Brandon walked to the podium and placed his phone on the lectern, connected to the projector. The clock started its countdown, 5:00, 4:59. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and steady, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Brandon Zeller, Lot 72, for the past 6 weeks. The board has been fining me and has filed an intent to lien my home for a workshop they claim violates CC&R 8.4.2 by infringing on a view corridor." He clicked a button on his phone. An image of the official 1987 county plat map appeared on the screen. This is the legal, recorded map of my property. As you can see, it shows a 10-foot utility easement at the rear of my lot. This is the only easement on record. The clock read 4:15. He clicked again. A second map appeared beside the first, the blurry, low-resolution version from the HOA's website. This is the map the board has been using for enforcement. It shows a 30-foot view corridor easement that does not legally exist. Gasps rippled through the audience. The clock read 3:30. I wondered why the board would need to enforce a non-existent easement so aggressively. I discovered it was created by an amendment to our CC&Rs that was pushed through last year. I also discovered this. He switched the slide. The image of Ms. Albright's email filled the screen. He had carefully redacted Margaret's name and her specific issue, just as he had promised. The clock read 2:45. He read the key passage aloud. My professional opinion is that this amendment is legally indefensible. An easement is a real property interest. It cannot be unilaterally imposed on a homeowner's private property. Attempting to enforce such a provision would be a breach of the board's fiduciary duty and would expose the association to significant legal liability. The clock read 1:50. The room was dead silent. The board was warned by their own attorney that what they were doing was illegal. Brandon continued, his voice rising with controlled power. So the question remains why? Why risk a lawsuit? Why invent a fake easement? He clicked to the final slide, a screenshot of the Vantage Point Properties brochure, with the phrase guaranteed by permanent view corridor easements circled in red. The clock read 1:0. This isn't about my workshop. It's about artificially creating valuable view corridors for the proposed luxury condos being built next door. A development project, by the way, in which our president's husband, Daniel Griffin, is a primary investor. The room exploded. Shouts of fraud and conflict of interest echoed off the pine-paneled walls. Charlene was on her feet, banging the gavel, her face a mask of fury. Your time is up. This is slander. This meeting is adjourned. Brandon ignored her, speaking over the din directly into the microphone. I have made copies of the county map, the lawyer's email, and the developer's corporate filings. They are available for every member at the back of the room. The clock hit 0:00. He stepped away from the podium, his work done. The chaos he left behind was the sound of a community taking back its power. The auditorium descended into what could only be described as procedural pandemonium. Homeowners surged to their feet, shouting questions at the board table. Charlene Griffin's frantic gaveling was completely lost in the uproar. Mr. Davies of Sterling Management stood up, attempting to restore order with placating gestures. But he was shouted down by a chorus of angry residents demanding answers. It was George Petrov, the former board member, who channeled the chaos into action. He strode to the microphone Brandon had just vacated. Motion from the floor, he boomed, his engineer's voice cutting through the noise. I move for the immediate suspension of the entire board of directors pending a full, independent forensic audit of the association's finances and records. Seconded came a dozen voices at once. Eleanor Vance stepped forward. According to our bylaws, a motion from the floor at an annual meeting requires a simple majority vote of the members present. I call for a vote by show of hands. The result was overwhelming. A forest of hands shot into the air in favor of the motion. When Eleanor asked for votes against, only 3 hands were raised, the board members at the table, looking pale and stunned. The motion carries, Eleanor declared with quiet finality. The board is hereby suspended. In the ensuing tumult, a woman near the front, who had been quietly taking notes on a steno pad, stood up and identified herself as a reporter for the local paper. She had come to cover the Vantage Point development proposal and had stumbled into a much bigger story. The carefully constructed facade of Summit Creek Estates had crumbled in less than 5 minutes. In the weeks that followed, the community began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. An interim board was appointed, led by Eleanor Vance, George Petrov, and a sharp, no-nonsense ER nurse named Dia. Their first official act was to pass a resolution declaring all fines and liens issued under the pretext of Ferber 8.4.2 null and void. The notices sent to Brandon and Margaret Gable were formally rescinded, along with a written apology from the association. The forensic audit, when it was completed, was even more damning than Brandon had imagined. It revealed that Charlene had not only been working to benefit her husband's development deal, but had also been systematically embezzling funds. She had used the HOA's discretionary account to pay for landscaping at her own home, billed expensive personal dinners as board meetings, and approved payments to shell companies that were traced back to a personal account. The audit findings were turned over to the district attorney's office, and what began as a civil dispute over a workshop morphed into a criminal investigation. The local news ran a front-page story with the headline, "Suburban Dream. Suburban Scheme, HOA President, Accused of Fraud and Embezzlement." Brandon was asked to lead a new committee tasked with rewriting the HOA's governing documents to ensure transparency and prevent such abuses from ever happening again. He accepted, feeling a sense of duty to finish what he had started. He spent his evenings working with Eleanor and Dia, crafting new bylaws that mandated open meetings, required multiple signatures for expenditures, and established a clear and simple process for homeowners to access all official records, including maps. Weeks later, the final surprise arrived not in a certified letter, but in the flashing blue and red lights of a squad car parked in Charlene Griffin's driveway. The criminal investigation, spurred by the audit, had uncovered irrefutable evidence of wire fraud and conspiracy. The reporter's article had prompted other communities managed by Sterling to review their own finances, revealing a wider pattern of mismanagement that ultimately led to the company losing dozens of contracts, including the one with Summit Creek. One crisp Saturday morning, long after the news crews had departed and a quiet normalcy had returned to the neighborhood, Brandon was walking his property line. He saw Margaret Gable in her yard, struggling to right a heavy stone garden gnome that had been knocked over in a recent windstorm. He walked over without a word, and together, they lifted the cheerful, ceramic figure and settled it firmly back into the soft earth. Margaret dusted off her hands and looked up, first at Brandon, then across the lawn to where his workshop stood, its cedar siding glowing in the morning sun. "It's a beautiful building, Brandon," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, hard-won gratitude. "I'm glad it's still standing." Brandon looked at the small structure he had built with his own hands, the sanctuary that had been at the center of the storm. It was just wood and nails and glass, but it had become a symbol of something much larger. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound act of community is the simple, stubborn refusal to be pushed off your own land. He helped Margaret straighten the gnome's crooked hat, a small, constructive act of repair, and felt a sense of peace deeper than any he had known in years.